Hello and welcome to the Centre for Brexit Studies YouTube channel. Today we're joined by our Senior Fellow, Dr. Stephen McCabe. So Steve, we're now over 3 weeks into lockdown and 4 weeks working from home. How are you dealing with these particularly challenging times?
Well, I'll be honest with you, I'm used to working on my home or at home and on my own. So in that sense, it's not so much a problem for me to adjusting. Apart from the fact that you want to go out and get some milk, for instance, and you have to sort of think carefully, do I really need this? So but I do appreciate for many, it's very difficult because of course they're used to sort of being in a crowded workplace and talking to other people on a face-to-face basis. So we're having to get used to sort of being with family in close proximity, which of course is fine if you've got space to sort of be on your own from time to time. But there are inevitably times when, of course, it does become a bit crowded. So I do understand for many people, it's been a very big culture shock. And let's face it, we're all social creatures. We like to sort of be with others. I try and swim, in normal times 2 or 3 times a week to keep fit. Well, clearly that option is not open. Going for walks is fine, but of course you've got to be careful about that, and you can't do it too often. So there has been a change, and I do notice it, but I appreciate for some it's bigger than others.
So the original plan just over 3 weeks ago was to review lockdown measures this week. But now we've been told that it's unlikely that restrictions will change in the next few weeks. So what are you anticipating to happen? And do you think it could be more like June, perhaps July time before restrictions start being lifted? And what impact do you think this could have on the economy?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the impact on the economy, because quite literally in the last half hour, the Office of Budget Responsibility has produced a report on the coronavirus, and they've in that assumed a 3-month lockdown. Now, of course, that we're into effectively the sort of almost a month gone, so that would certainly take us through the sort of the remainder of this month and through May and possibly into sort of June. So 3 months, depending from where you started from. But as I say, another couple of months. I guess that sounds pretty realistic, and importantly, what they said is that sort of that will have a pretty dramatic impact upon the economy. They're talking about a drop in GDP of 35%, a third. And normally we talk about sort of up or down by a fraction of percent at most. So to lose a third is kind of unprecedented indeed. If you look at the sort of the historical sort of trends since sort of the First World War, it's bigger than happened during the First World War, the Spanish flu, the Second World War. It's phenomenal. They're also predicting sort of unemployment will sort of go up by up to 2 million, which is pretty high. Again, we're up to sort of to the levels that we sort of anybody who's been around in the sort of 1980s may have sort of remembered. Now, of course, that's obviously sort of pretty destructive. What the OBR say is the sort of the lockdown will be of a short duration, and therefore when the sort of restrictions are lifted, then things will start to bounce back, although they do have the caveat that unemployment will sort of lag more slowly than the sort of the bounce back in the economy. But of course, what that does depend upon is that sort of I think everyone's assuming that in a certain period, whether it be another 4 weeks or 8 weeks, or possibly even longer, depending upon the sort of the rate at which death occurs, that'll be the end of it. What we've got to remember is that this problem is not solved. All that has happened, which of course was the sort of the primary objective, was to flatten the curve. We've still got to sort of to work towards getting the vaccine up and running, which probably won't be until at the very most optimistic later on this year, and it may be next year. And so what I'm saying is that sort of even if the lockdown ends and things start to come back to some form of normality, it will be very different to what was the case up until 4 weeks ago, certainly before we sort of started going into lockdown measures. And I think certainly social distancing may continue for months and months to come. And I think only when the vaccine is up and running and we've got a much more sort of rigorous testing regime, which is certainly sort of pretty woeful thus far, excuse me, will we start to think about sort of getting back to sort of the as I call it, normality. I mean, the one blessing you might sort of say is that this has happened during the summer, which I know has its own problem because, of course, we like to be out and about during the summer. But imagine if this had happened coming up to Christmas and in the middle of winter. So there are difficulties. But hey, we're into unknown territory, and of course, what we're seeing is, I believe, a sort of leveling out of the infections. The deaths tend to lag behind it, and of course, for every one of those deaths, that's a personal tragedy, and for the individual involved and their families. But coming back to what we would a normal sort of summer, I think it's a bit of a write-off this year, and I don't think people will be going on holidays for starters.
So on that note, of course, normally many of us would have gone away over the bank holiday weekend. So surely seaside towns and tourist destinations are going to be some of the worst affected areas out of all of this, as well as the industries, as obviously seasonal traders are obviously facing a really uncertain future.
Well, yeah, I mean, quite precisely that just to say the holiday trade was probably one of the first to be affected. We saw the Flybe as probably the first, I wouldn't call it major, but certainly significant corporate casualty. We see the big travel companies are experiencing difficulties. Big airlines are they're finding difficulty, even though many of them have furloughed their staff, which of course, let's remember, is all adding to the debt that we're all going to have to pay for at some point in the immediate future. And you're absolutely right that seaside towns, which depend upon, because they don't have industry, they depend upon tourism. They didn't have any visitors this bank holiday. They probably won't have any the next bank holiday, maybe not even the one after that in the late May bank holiday. And who knows, because of, as I mentioned a couple of moments ago, social distancing, major tourist spots will not be open for business in the normal way that they would be. Maybe until mid or late summer. And of course, what we also are aware is that the tourist industry and hospitality have been really badly affected by this. So people have lost their forms of employment that they would normally have been expecting at this time of year. So the coronavirus is having a knock-on effect in so many different ways. And again, just to emphasise the the public debt as a result of this, because of course we're all going to have to pick up the tab somehow or other to try and keep the economy on a form of life support until eventually we start to return to normality, whenever that is.
So obviously you touched upon international travel there. So do you think there will be somewhat of a travel boom after this, with people eager to fly to new destinations, see new things, after being kind of locked inside for quite a long time? Or do you think we can expect people to perhaps holiday within the UK instead?
Well, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, it depends when it ends. I mean, I think people would like to certainly this time of year, they would like to be thinking about their holidays wherever it might be in Europe or beyond. International travel, I think, for the very foreseeable future is off the agenda. Indeed, the Foreign Office said that people shouldn't be planning trips indefinitely, which suggests that they see this as long haul. I mean, it'd be great to think, because of course, remember, the destinations, like destinations in the UK, many thousands and in local areas and millions across the world, depending upon the free flow of tourists going to visit their places of interest and the places that we go to in terms of hotels and restaurants. So this knock-on effect is having will be having dreadful effects for the local economies. I mean, you mentioned going away in this country. I still think that might be difficult, because if social distancing continues throughout the summer, which I think there's a good possibility it will do, because let's face it, the infection has not disappeared and certainly won't do, then therefore will people want to go to crowded tourist destinations to rub shoulders with others and come back with coronavirus? I don't think so. It really is. It's that there's all sorts of different effects, and of course, as we know, hotels, guest houses, restaurants, they're all finding it really, really difficult. Just an aside, I saw a thing on the news yesterday about Italy, and what they suggested there is that that they are starting to relax their measures, but they were saying that the small restaurants and hostelries where people are in very close proximity to one another, they will probably be the last to be allowed to reopen. But of course, many of them will find it just impossible to survive, because of course they've had this for the last couple of months, and with no income or no revenue, then they're just not going to survive.
So the EU and UK will return to Brexit negotiations this week. So normally by this stage, 3 full negotiating rounds were supposed to have happened by now and completed. Of course, this hasn't happened because of the ongoing crisis. Is it looking likely then that the deadline for the extension will have to be looked at fairly soon?
Well, logic would dictate in normal circumstances, and these are far from normal circumstances, that you would have been looking at an extension. And the view is also that much will depend upon the view of the cabinet, and of course the most important person in cabinet, the first among equals, so to speak, is a certain Boris Johnson. Well, Boris Johnson's had more than Brexit to worry about the last week or so. Yeah. So, given he's getting back up to health, I think that the current crisis will occupy minds for weeks, if not months to come. Brexit, therefore, slips off the agenda. But of course, as we know, that the law is that we leave the EU, indeed we have left the EU, to be fair. But of course, by the end of this year, we're supposed to have a free trade agreement in place, or else we revert to World Trade Organization rules. Now, of course, the thing is, though, that given everything we're suffering, even that looks pretty good in comparison. But nonetheless, it would be that the coronavirus is, we hope, something which is temporary in nature. Leaving the EU without a trade agreement after the 31st of December is something which will last for, I wouldn't say in perpetuity, but a long time. So that it would be another blow to many manufacturers and industry in general, on top of everything else. And I think it's something we could do with that. So my view would be, if there was any common sense, then what they would be looking for is a maybe a year, couple of years, a period of grace, so we can all sort ourselves out. The fact also is, of course, that the EU has gone through its own travails in terms of the funding for Italy and Spain, which have been worst affected, and it took a lot of horse trading and furious negotiating last week to get the £500 billion bailout for their economies. So the EU has not come out of it too well. I would say certainly that there will be a push among many, and certainly business interests, to go for an extension. But of course, as we know, this government is made up, and particularly the cabinet as present, is made up of a lot of Brexiteers. So it'll be interesting to see which way that they want to jump on this one.
Thanks for joining me, Steve, and best wishes to those watching.